Today, we've got a conversation about some of AWC's most important research, looking into feral predators, foxes and cats. For a lot of you, this subject will be familiar, but I just want to set the scene a little bit before we get stuck in, and I'll introduce Dr. Andrew Carter in a moment. So what do we know about foxes and cats? Well, first of all, we know that they weren't here originally. If you could go back in time 500 years, there were no cats or foxes on the Australian mainland. They arrived around the time of European settlement from ships and coastal settlements and spread rapidly across the continent. For Australia's wildlife, they represented a completely new type of predator. So our animals haven't evolved to cope with this kind of efficient mammalian carnivore. There are three components to the cat population. We received a lot of questions about pet cats, but that we're looking at feral cats, stray cats and domestic cats. AWC's focus is mostly on feral cats. And just to be clear, that's a population that sustains itself out in the bush. So it's a self-sustaining population that's been there for at least a couple of hundred years. The impact that cats have had on wildlife is profound. So each night, cats kill around 3 million mammals, 2 million reptiles and 1 million birds. And if you look at that over the year, it's about 3% of Australia's total bird population being killed by cats every year. They're found in virtually all habitats, and they've taken a really heavy toll on wildlife. In the time since European settlement, Australia's lost 34 mammal species to extinction, and of those, around 25 can be attributed mainly to cats and foxes. So the total population size of cats is hard to estimate. It probably fluctuates with conditions between 2 million and 6 million, but we know that they're having a devastating impact on wildlife, which brings us to what AWC is doing about it. And at this point, I'll introduce Dr. Andrew Carter. Andrew is a wildlife ecologist based in Narrabri in northern New South Wales. Welcome, Andrew, to AWC in Conversation.
G'day, Joey. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
No worries. Thanks for joining. So, Andrew, you grew up in the bush or in the country. What was your path into conservation?
Good question. Yeah, grew up in the bush. Just loved being outdoors. It wasn't a natural progression to go into conservation. I just wanted a career that enabled me to get out in the great outdoors, enjoy the fresh air, have the sunshine on my back. And went to university, found myself gravitating towards ecology-based research. Did an honours project looking at different survey techniques for arboreal marsupials, and then found myself continuing on with research, looking at Bushstone curlews, an endangered bird species in southern Australia, and the impacts of foxes on that beautiful bird. There we go. Bushstone curlew.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that? So, PhD is a fairly major project. What was your particular question there?
Essentially, we were trying to determine what was going on with the population in southern Australia. So people from northern Australia, Cairns, Magnetic Island, there are Bushstone curlews in the streets of the towns, and there's lots of them. In southern Australia, it's a different story. The birds have really disappeared from the landscape in the last 20, 30, 40 years. So my project was about trying to understand what was driving that. The principal thought was fox predation. So my project was about understanding how foxes use the landscape, how we're managing foxes in the areas where the curlews are managing to hang on.
Really interesting. And, that's another point which we might come to later, but, foxes have only spread not quite into the tropics, so they're sort of limited to southern Australia. And it sounds like you picked up on that in the Bushstone curlew work.
Yeah, look, they're interesting species in that they're a threatened species, but in southern Australia, they're largely confined to private farmland. Typically, threatened species are on public land. And there are a couple of really strong pools of evidence to suggest that foxes are the key driver. So there's lots of curlews, as you say, in northern Australia, in the tropics where there aren't any foxes or foxes are in super low numbers. And a place like Kangaroo Island, there's lots of feral cats on Kangaroo Island, unfortunately. We have a healthy population of Bushstone curlews there, but no foxes.
Not exactly what you'd expect.
Mm.
When you joined AWC, you were initially based at Scotia Wildlife Sanctuary, and I know a lot of the people listening will have been to Scotia in Western New South Wales. Can you describe that property and what your role was out there?
Yeah, I joined Scotia having spent the previous 3 years in beautiful Tasmania, where I think I could count on one hand the number of days that the temperature was above 30 degrees. And then when I arrived at Scotia, it was the middle of January. I think it was 46 degrees, bushfires, flies like I'd never seen before. It was quite an experience. But yeah, Scotia, semi-arid, mallee woodland, wonderful landscape. And the project that AWC runs at Scotia is incredible. There's a predator exclusion fence there, about 8,000 hectares, where there's no foxes, no cats, and we've reintroduced a whole suite of species which once would have lived in that area, but sadly have disappeared due to the impacts of foxes and cats. So it was a great introduction to the work that AWC does, to be able to see firsthand the impact that cats and foxes have and how different the landscape can be if we can manage their impacts.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So you'd already been researching foxes in unfenced landscapes. Then you came to this area which included a predator-free haven full of native mammals. I should say too, that one you're holding there is a bridled nail-tail wallaby, and at least half the population of that species is found at Scotia inside the fence, which just goes to show how important these fenced havens are. I'd just like to talk a little bit about AWC's overall strategy when it comes to feral predators. And I guess the first part of it is creating that network of feral predator-free fenced havens. So people might have heard of our projects at New Haven, our new partnerships in New South Wales National Parks at Pilliga and Mallee Cliffs. Scotia, of course, has been established for a long time. And I guess that part of the strategy is about maintaining populations of some of the most threatened mammal species in particular, things like bilbies, numbats, those bridled nail-tail wallabies, and some of the bettongs. They only survive, or almost only survive, in areas with little or no feral predation. The second part of the strategy is what we'll focus on mostly today, and that's looking at research into feral cats and foxes outside of fenced areas. Andrew, you've been working on this project now for 5 years. Do you want to talk about how it fits into what's gone before with AWC's research into feral cats?
Yeah, so AWC's got a long history of research into feral predators. So some people would be familiar with the work that was done in Kimberley, which linked feral cats with fire regimes. The work there of Hugh McGregor found that feral cats were travelling a long way to hunt on the edge of fire scars. And that work was translated across to Cape York and northern Queensland. This research that we're talking about today, and I should point out that it's really not just me conducting this research. I'm here today talking about it, but there's been many other people that have helped drive it along the way, not least David Rocher, my immediate boss, who's been pushing it along in the background all the way. So this is definitely a team effort, but it's designed to build on that research that we've done in Northern Australia, this time in a landscape where we have foxes and cats. So we're adding another predator to the mix.
Yeah, so I guess, some of the important findings out of the Kimberley were that you could manage fire in a way that limits or at least moderates the impact of feral cats. That's something that we're now able to apply across our Northern Australian sanctuaries. In Southern Australia, we want to know what's required to improve the fate of wildlife species when there isn't a fence. But to do that, we really need to know a lot more about these animals. So what was the current state of knowledge about cats and foxes when you started this work?
Surprisingly little, Joey. I mean, for two species that have had such a huge impact on our native wildlife, when you drill down at it, our knowledge of their basic ecology was very poor. Very few studies on how they use the landscape, and that's critical to understanding how we can manage them more effectively is just understanding their basic ecology, how big an area they roam over, what they eat, do they overlap, how do they interact. All of those building blocks of spatial ecology just were very poorly known. So we essentially had to go back to the first base to build up our knowledge base of foxes and cats in this landscape, to build on our strategy for dealing with them outside in open landscapes.
So really fundamental ecology of where animals move around, how big their territories are, whether they have a preference for different habitats or, you know, that kind of stuff. It sounds like a massive knowledge gap. And like you say, for such a significant threat, that's obviously a high priority for AWC to work out a bit more so that we can manage it more effectively. I'm just going to share a map to point out the different sites where this project has been happening so far. Do you want to talk us through that, Andrew?
Yep, so we've got Scotia in southwestern New South Wales, semi-arid, mallee woodland. That's where the bulk of this research that we're discussing today has taken place. So that research started in 2015, and we've collared 30 cats and 30 foxes over that time period, following their detailed movements. In the last year, we've extended that research to the Pilliga in northern New South Wales, which is where I'm currently based, and also across in WA at Mount Gibson, which is another property where we have a large predator exclusion fence where foxes and cats and introduced predators have been removed, and we've reintroduced a whole suite of native species.
So you mentioned there that you've collared, what was it, 30 cats?
30 cats and 30 foxes, yeah, over the last 5 years.
Scotia. Now that, you know, people might think, oh yeah, go out and catch a cat, but how do you actually do that? Because these are, you know, pretty wily animals. You don't often come across cats when you're out in the bush. How do you catch a cat?
It's a good question. A lot of patience, a lot of hard work. It's definitely not an easy thing to do, catch foxes and cats. So just really drilling down, looking at, so this is one of the methods that we've used. There's a trap hidden there underneath that fallen timber and those branches. So it's a buried trap. It was designed and built by an AWC staff member, Murray Schofield. Essentially, it's meant to mimic a rabbit burrow. You put a bait inside there, and a rabbit, a fox or a cat, you know, smells the bait inside, gets curious, walks in, stands on a treadle plate, and then a drop door falls down, and they're stuck inside. So yeah, trying every trick we can, using all sorts of different baits, you know, feathers, dung, bacon, mice, chicken, rabbit, you name it, basically anything that might prick the interest of a cat or a fox to lure it close enough to one of our traps to put its foot in the right place. So we use foothold traps, we use cage traps, we use these buried traps. Yeah, but it's hard yakka. So here's one of the cage traps. You can see some feathers there that I've put down to act as a bit of a visual lure as well. Sometimes I'll put a CD at the back of the trap or some tinsel just to prick the interest of. What
sort of CD, Andrew? Is there a musical preference for these animals?
The cats tend to like hip hop.
Yeah, I'm not so much. Yeah.
So that's generally the genre that I focused on. Occasionally country and western, but hip hop tend to be more successful.
Excellent. Yeah, so I guess they do seem to be quite curious animals, so that the glinting CD or the feathers does help draw them in. We always get this question, so I'll preempt it. You're catching these cats and then letting them go again. Do you have mixed feelings about that, knowing how many animals they'll be killing every night?
I do. It doesn't sit comfortably to let these animals go, but the reality is that they've been here for 200 plus years, and we've had all of that time to develop strategies for minimising their impact, and we've basically come up with donuts. So the only way that we can really improve the way that we manage these species and ultimately limit the impact they have on our native species is to understand them and how they use the landscape. And the only way that we can do that is via the methods that we're using at Scotia and Pilliga and elsewhere. And that's to catch the animals, fit them with collars, and understand how they use the landscape. Yes.
So, the collars that you're fitting them with, what sort of technology are they packing?
It's changed throughout the project. So this cat here is fitted with a GPS collar. So it collects location points whenever we specify. Typically it was at 20-minute intervals. And then in order for us to obtain that information, I had to get to within about 50 metres of the cat or the fox to download it remotely using a UHF antenna. As the project progressed, technology advanced, and we worked with the manufacturers in America to develop a collar that was small enough that would bypass the need to stalk these animals in the bush and get so close. So it sent the information automatically up to the satellites and then beamed it back to us. So that was revolutionary in terms of the way that we got the data back, and it really opened up some fascinating insights into what these animals are doing in the landscape.
I can see we've got people asking questions, and a reminder for people who have joined more recently, you can use the Q&A button to ask questions of Andrew and I. Please try and keep the chat just for technical issues if you're having problems connecting. A question just then though, which I think we can address now, do you castrate them or spay them before you release them, or would that change their behaviour too much?
No, that would change their behaviour. So we're just leaving them as they are. And I know that is a difficult concept for some people to grasp. But if we were to spay them, then it changes the social dynamics, and then we're not getting a true picture of what's going on in the landscape. So we need to understand a natural environment in order to develop our methods for controlling these species.
Yeah, I think the underlining thing here is that the most important thing we can get from these animals is information. We need to understand how they're using the landscape if we're going to get to a future where we can actually reduce their numbers or improve the fate for native animals outside of fenced areas. I know you've probably moved past this technology now, but it's too good not to share a photo of this device. Can you explain this sort of Ghostbuster van that you've created?
Yeah. This is a tracking tower that my father and I created many years ago when I was doing that study I mentioned earlier on foxes and Bushstone curlews. So it enabled me to drive around and search for animals without having to get out of the car and stand on the back of the ute and do it all manually by hand. So that was a wonderful creation. It still lives on in AWC. It's currently in the Pilliga, being used to help track down bridle nail-tail wallabies. So it's definitely earned its pennies over the years.
Great. Now, well, I'll skip the next one, which looks like it's an extension of that technology. But sometimes even your Ghostbusters mobile isn't enough to pick up a signal. Can you talk about what happened at Scotia when one of the cats just wasn't being detected?
Yeah. So in the second year of the cat collaring project, I think we collared about 10 cats. And we had a whole heap of camera traps out throughout the study area, and driving around with that ute, getting up in a plane, which you can see the picture here, we just couldn't pick up a signal. There was only a few cats that remained in the area, and they weren't showing up on the camera traps either. So there's two possibilities there. Either the technology has failed or the cats have travelled further away than we searched. The fact that they weren't showing up on the camera traps led us to think that it wasn't technology failure, that these animals were travelling much further than we previously thought. So despite spending 2 days in a plane searching over 1 million hectares, we didn't pick up a single cat. So that's when we started working with the collar manufacturers in America to change the tools that we had at our disposal. And as I said earlier, we managed to shrink the technology down small enough to be able to fit it onto a feral cat, whereby we didn't physically have to locate that cat again on the ground to get the data. And in the first month of fitting those collars to cats the following year, it was a light bulb moment. It just reinforced what our gut was telling us, that these cats are traveling a long way. So this map you can see here, each of those different colours is a different individual cat. So all of these cats were caught within Scotia, which you're pointing out there, Joey.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of them just travelled enormous distances. So we had the blue cat over towards the left-hand side. It travelled over 160 kilometres in the space of about 3 weeks. The brown dots heading down towards the Murray River, it too travelled a similar distance, as about 150 kilometres from where it was caught. The green cat over on the right-hand side, it travelled down to the Murray River as well, stayed there for a couple of months, and then went back to Scotia. So this was really the first time that we were able to demonstrate the movement capabilities of these feral cats. Typically, with the technology that we had at our disposal, and this is not just us, this is anyone who was doing these types of projects, if the animal disappeared, then you never got that data back. So with the advances in technology, we were able to still retrieve all of the info, even though these cats were hundreds of kilometres from the study area.
That's a real revelation. I think, it's terrifying to think that these are all cats caught within a relatively small area at Scotia, so right on the border with South Australia and New South Wales. But imagine that pattern with, territories overlapping right across the country. And, they're not animals that we see a lot, but they're out there and they're moving around, which really underscores the impact that they can have on wildlife.
So just getting back to your point earlier, Joey, this is why I release cats and foxes with collars, because if I just caught them and killed them, then we would not be able to understand that this is what's going on. We'd be where we are now with no real understanding of how we can better tackle the issue that they bring to the table. So the pain of letting these animals go is offset by the information that we can gain by doing so.
I think that's a really important point to make. So one of the objectives of your research has been to generate a method of working out the density of cats and foxes. So density, it's easy enough to think about the number of animals per area, but that's actually quite a challenging figure to get, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So we know that our fences work. They help protect species that are really struggling on the outside or don't exist on the outside world where there are cats and foxes. This research is about trying to get some of those species out into the broader landscape where cats and foxes will still be present. They won't be completely eradicated, but they'll be controlled intensively and ongoingly to reduce their numbers. So before we get to the stage of releasing animals outside the fence or considering releasing animals outside the fence, we need to understand what is going on with the cat and the fox population, how many there are out there. That's the starting point. And then from there, we can understand how our different management options, how effective they are. And then from there, build towards those outside the fence releases. But the starting point is understanding how many cats and foxes we have. And it hasn't been done a lot because it's actually very challenging. It sounds easy, but it's hard work. So historically, cats and foxes have been monitored using activity indices. So generally, you're counting the signs that these animals leave behind, whether it's footprints or their dung, but you're not actually creating an estimate of how many animals are on the ground. You're just getting a feel for their activity. And if you repeat those surveys over time, you get trends. The assumption is if the trend is increasing, that so too are the numbers of animals on the ground. But that's a really big assumption. And in the few instances where that's been tested, that assumption has generally fallen over. So for this project, given the objectives, we've gone the extra mile and we're trying to develop methods that will enable us to have really robust estimates of cat and fox density so that we can build on developing better methods to control cats and foxes, but ultimately reduce their impact on the native species. And that's a really important distinction, that this research is not about trying to understand how to kill cats and foxes, because we could kill millions of cats and foxes, but if doing so is not going to benefit the native species that we're trying to protect, then essentially it's a waste of time. We're trying to develop management processes that will benefit the native species, not kill animals per se.
Yeah, so, you know, the mission of Australian Wildlife Conservancy is effective conservation for all Australian animal species and their habitats. You know, to that end, it doesn't mean kill all the cats you can. It just means create an environment where native species can thrive. And your research, Andrew, is filling a really important knowledge gap that will help enable that to happen. We haven't yet talked about camera traps, but camera traps are another really important aspect of this work. And you get some wonderful images, but do you want to just tell us what sort of information you get from camera trapping, especially in concert with the GPS tracking?
Yeah, so the camera traps are the key tool that we're using to generate these density estimate methods. So these camera traps work, we put them out in the field. They have passive infrared sensors. So when an animal walks in front of the camera trap, it'll take a series of photographs. Those photographs are stamped with the date and the time. And by simultaneously running these trap collaring and trapping programs with camera trap surveys, when we get collared individuals, we can be certain who we're looking at. And that's key to developing these methods and understanding how the various methods relate to the activity that we might see from a sand plot survey, for instance.
Okay, and you've mentioned recently to me that you've seen some interesting interactions between different individuals. That's sort of a new part of the data, and I might I'll just pull up a map and you can talk to that for a minute. But what's your current understanding? Are they mostly territorial, or do they cross over quite regularly? How are they interacting with each other?
It varies between the two species, so foxes and cats. So this map here is of 3 cats that we collared. So the bluey dots, that's a female, and then the red and the green, they're males. So these were 3 cats that were occupying a shared component of the study area. And what we found, and this is work that David Rocha has literally just uncovered in the last week, is that there was a 10-week period in the year where these 3 cats were interacting, they were coming into contact with each other. So it was the same 10-week period that one female was coming into contact with 2 different males, and the 2 males were coming into contact with each other as well. So we're talking, you know, up to 180 contacts for some of these species. And that's down to within 1 metre in many of those instances. So this is not a primary objective of the research that we're doing, but it's a benefit of going to the effort of collaring so many foxes and cats and setting the study up in a way that maximises our learnings. So the primary objective is to be able to generate density estimates and understand how the animals are using the landscape. But all of these little bits of information help us build a better picture of cats and foxes, how they interact, and then how we might be able to tweak our management to be more effective at reducing their impact. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, that's the way that AWC operates. So the research that we conduct isn't just for the sake of finding out more about how the world works. It's always applied. And this is a really great example of understanding one of the most important threats to Australia's wildlife so that we can manage it better and reduce that risk. Mm-hmm. All right, so it's just after 12 o'clock, so it's a big topic to cover today, and we're getting lots of questions too. We've got 60 questions that have come in the time we've been speaking, and we will try and get to some of those over the next few minutes. Andrew, one which we always get asked is, are these animals different in size to domestic cats? And are there differences in size between different regions?
Yes and yes. So different regions, certainly. So this photo that's behind you, Joey, that's a cat from Scotia. Just have a look at the forearms on that cat. Super chunky, full of muscle, big fat neck. So these are animals that have been in this landscape for a long time. They've evolved, their body shape has changed, they're big, they're muscly. So they're not monsters. You know, you hear stories of 12 kilogram, 15 kilogram feral cats. I think the heaviest feral cat I've caught was just under 6 kilograms. So, you know, a well cared and loved and fed moggy in someone's backyard may well weigh 8 kilograms. So pound for pound, there's probably not much difference between pets and feral cats in a lot of instances, but it's the composition, their body shape that differs in a lot of cases.
Yeah, great. I'll just say now, in case anyone is unable to stay for the remainder of the questions, if you'd like more information about this, check out our latest edition of Wildlife Matters. That's our magazine, which comes out twice a year. It's available on our website. Go to australianwildlife.org. Or if you're signed up as a supporter, you'll get a print edition, or you can opt to get a print edition in the mail. Okay, lots more questions coming in. I think, you know, the really important thing here is the next step. So you've done a lot of work so far, but this is a long-term research project. As you've said, the end goal is creating a situation where we can trial introductions of maybe things like quolls or possums or even bilbies outside of fenced areas. But what's left to do before we get to that point?
What's left to do is to further develop the methods for generating density estimates. So all of this effort we've been talking about today, collaring cats and foxes, putting out camera traps, we understand that we can't do that every time we want to generate a density estimate for foxes and cats. So what we're trying to do is develop a method whereby we don't need to collar simultaneously with our camera trap surveys, and we don't need to individually identify animals when they show up on camera traps. So in a sense, that's a bit of a holy grail, to have a robust density estimate that isn't as demanding in terms of the data that it requires. So we've been working with a statistician, some of the leading minds in this space, to develop this method. We're right on the cusp of cracking it. So the next step is to continue furthering that methodology, to apply it to the other sites where we've been working. So we mentioned there the Pilliga and Mount Gibson, to see how well the method is applied across different landscapes, and then to refine our management practices to make sure that we can reduce the density of cats and foxes to low levels and maintain them at those low levels, so that we can try and get these species back into the broader landscape.
Yeah, okay.
But it's hard, Jacko. At the moment, essentially, once you start controlling cats and foxes for this objective, then you can't stop. It's got to be ongoing, it's got to be intensive, and you can't take your foot off the pedal. Otherwise, you saw from that map that you showed of the distances that these cats are travelling. If you take your foot off the pedal, then there'll always be cats moving in from the surrounding landscape, re-invading. So it has to be ongoing and intensive.
So you've got a job for a few years yet, Andrew, by the sound of things.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so.
People are really keen to know, when does this lead to eradication of cats? And I think at this point we can mention that in the long term, our vision is for an Australia where there are no feral cats. And that's sort of separate to the work you've been doing, but we're interested in potential genetic technologies that could be used. Some people might have heard of a gene drive, which is a way of modifying the genome of an animal such that it, for example, can only give birth to males. So, you know, over a few generations, all of the cats within a population become male, and then the population collapses. At the moment, those gene drives are getting a lot of attention, and we think that's probably the best prospect for the sort of technology that might be able to remove a whole population of feral animals. But as you know, as we always say, that's a long-term research goal. AWC has partnered with CSIRO, and we're investing in research into that technology, especially into how it might be applied in the conservation setting. So, you know, down the track, maybe there'll be a time where there are no feral cats in Australia. Do you think that's a possible goal or just a dream, Andrew?
Oh, I think we should always aspire towards that, but it's, you know, it's not realistic in the short or medium term. So I think the smartest way to proceed is to accept that we've got cats and foxes in the landscape, to continue on with our strategy of building these predator-free areas to safeguard against further extinctions for key species, and to just get smarter at how we manage cats and foxes. And that is not easy, clearly. We haven't had a great run so far, but it's research like this that needs to continue on to try and crack the nut in terms of how do these animals use the landscape? Are there any chinks in their armour that we can exploit, that we can really reduce their numbers, give them a hard time, and give our native species a chance to persist?
So that brings us to what control methods are available. So you mentioned that, you know, part of this will involve baiting cats. What baits are currently used, and how effective are each of the different options?
There's quite a few different options. Foxes are an easier species to deal with because they're quite happy to take carrion, you know, to dig rotten meat up. So you can just use baits that are buried in the ground for foxes, and that's an effective strategy. Cats, it's a different story. They prefer to hunt live prey. So baiting is a much more difficult prospect. And if there are baits that have been developed for cats, there's little sausage, chipolata type baits, but they're limited generally to a winter period where there's not so many reptiles out in the landscape. The cats are hungry, they're more likely to take a bait. So most of the cat baiting work has been in WA, Western Australia. Eradication has been used quite successfully across broad landscapes. Just recently, earlier this year, a new bait, Curiosity, has been partly approved for use in Eastern Australia. So that gives us another tool in the kit to deal with cats. There's another device which is called a Felixer. It's attracted a lot of attention, developed by John Reed. It's a really unique device. So it's a box essentially, and when an animal walks in front of it, it's got an algorithm in it, and based on the shape and the gait of these animals, it works out whether or not it's a feral cat or a fox. If it gets green lights that, yeah, it's a feral cat or a fox, and it squirts poison on the animal, and cats, being fastidious groomers, will lick that poison off and ingest a lethal dose. It's been shown to work for foxes as well. But at the moment, they're just too cost prohibitive to apply across massive landscapes. So they're about $15,000 each to buy outright. So until the price comes down, they're probably limited in the situations where they're applicable. There are other devices as well, but essentially dealing with cats in particular, it's hard yakka. It's being out on the ground, just putting in the hard yards and maintaining that effort across the year.
Yeah, a really hard job, but obviously worth it. And you know, we're at the point now where at Mount Gibson, as you mentioned, we'll be trialing some aerial baiting. At the same time as doing this work to measure the density to see what sort of impact that has, with a view to sometime down the track, trying some of those reintroductions outside the fence. All right, a couple more questions here. One about Indigenous involvement, and we know that you know, in Central Australia, AWC has been working really closely with our team of Warlpiri Rangers. They're part of the AWC team, Alice and Christine, who were critical in eradicating cats from that fenced area project at New Haven, and we'll talk more about New Haven on a future webinar. Has there been other Indigenous involvement in the project that you've been working on?
Not in Scotia. It's just been the local crew there. But yeah, the work that the Walpurgis Rangers have done at New Haven is incredible. The number of cats that they've pulled out of that landscape is remarkable, and their knowledge of the way that these animals use the landscape is invaluable. And the more that we can tap into that Indigenous knowledge to help us understand these animals, the better we'll be equipped to reduce their impact. So I think moving forward, it's a really key tool in the kit where that information exists. Use it as much as we can.
Absolutely. A couple more questions here, just following up on how you might control cats across a large scale. And people are asking about viruses. My understanding is that viruses are sort of out of favour now because, you know, if you look at the cat family globally, there's actually a whole lot of endangered species. Just because we don't have any native cats here, you know, it's a really huge risk that you might accidentally wipe out clouded leopards and tigers, and that would be terribly embarrassing. So I guess the elegance of that gene drive technology we were describing is that it's really specific to one species because it's passed on through inheritance, so through breeding, and it's inherited by the next generation. So at the moment, genetics is where we're looking for those long-term answers. But in the meantime, there's a lot of work to do to boost populations of native species. All right, I'll just see what other questions we've got here. Just looking at those big movements, and I'll just share the map from the other site at the Pilliga. Was there a difference in the sorts of cats that move? Was it, you know, male cats rather than female cats, or was there a difference in behaviour between ones that moved and ones that stayed put?
No, we had both males and females moving long distances. So this is another data set from the Pilliga in northern New South Wales. So these are feral cats. Again, each different colour is a different individual. So we're seeing similar patterns between what we observed at Scotia and what we observed in the Pilliga, despite there being very different landscapes. So that is encouraging in terms of our ability to understand the behaviour of feral cats. So we've got really long distance movements. We've got animals going back and forth across the landscape. So, you know, that is another important finding in terms of our ability to understand how the behaviour, the spatial ecology of these species differs across different landscapes in Australia. But at the moment, we're starting to tease out some commonalities which we can work with moving forward.
Thanks, Andrew. Another one here just asking about whether, you know, we've used drones in some cases for monitoring native species. Has there been any thought of using drones to monitor ferals or to even control them?
Yes, certainly. Yep. The thermal cameras fitted to drones have been trialled as part of our eradication projects. That's happening as we speak to try and remove the last few individuals from inside our fence populations. But, you know, we're dealing with really large areas here, you know, 5 to 10,000 hectares, and there are other species in there that show up on the infrared cameras. So it's a tool that's worth pursuing, but it's not, at the moment, it's not the silver bullet.
We've had quite a few questions here about the baits and how you ensure that they're affecting the target species, but that you're not also getting off-target native species in that process.
Yeah, there's a few different options. So another tool which I didn't mention is they're called canid pest ejectors. So with those devices, they're fixed in the ground. They have a spring that sits below the ground, and then a little bait head which sits above the ground, which contains a capsule with toxicant in it. And they can only be triggered by an animal that has a force strong enough to set that spring off. So it's really only feral cats, large feral cats, foxes and dogs in this landscape that would target them, that would trigger them. So that prevents smaller non-target species from getting a taste of the toxin, and it also prevents any animals from moving that toxin from where you've left it. So that's a key tool in doing it. It's also making sure that for foxes, those baits are buried, so that reduces the risk of non-target species coming along and encountering a bait. But also most of our native species are far more tolerant of the toxin that we use. So a fox or a cat would only have to consume one bait containing a standard dose, whereas a lot of our native species would have to eat multiple baits. So that's when it comes down to the importance of spacing your baits at appropriate intervals so that you're limiting the opportunity for non-target species to have access to multiple baits.
And I'm not sure, did you mention just then the tolerance of that of native species due to the chemical found in plants?
Yeah, so in Western Australia in particular, our native species co-evolved with plant species in the gastrolobium family, so like a bush pea. There's also some gidgee species in Queensland and the Northern Territory, which naturally contain sodium fluoroacetate. It's part of their natural defence to try and limit insects and mammals from eating their foliage. So it's a natural part of those landscapes, and our native species have co-evolved with it, so they have a higher tolerance than these introduced species, the cats and the foxes. They're much more susceptible to that toxin.
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of quirk of evolution that it's actually helped us out. And it's probably the reason that numbats and a few other things have survived in that area on the mainland where there are a lot of those gastrolobium plants. Andrew, thank you. That's been a fantastic session, and we've had lots and lots of questions, like over 100 questions that have come in. I apologise if we haven't been able to address it today, but I'd like to share with you this article. So this is an article written by Andrew and his colleagues in our latest edition of Wildlife Matters. It's a really good summary of what we're up to with this project and what the next steps are. And you know, as this progresses, we'll be sure to keep you updated. So if you're not already subscribed on email to our updates, go to australianwildlife.org, and at the bottom of the page, you can subscribe to email updates. That way, you'll also be sure to get the invites to our upcoming webinars as well. So Andrew, thanks for the article as well. It's great. There's a bunch of scientific papers that you've published as well. Do you have any coming out in the near future?
We're busy preparing 3, 4, 5 manuscripts at the moment. So it's a bit of a slow process in science, but we've got a number that hopefully will be accepted and published in the next 12 months or so. And people can check that out on the website, I'd imagine, if and when they're published.
Yeah, we can certainly share it online on the website. So yeah, stay tuned, and we'll keep you up to date with all of the breakthroughs in this work. Andrew, I'd like to thank you again. So thanks for coming on, and maybe we'll get you back in a year or two when there's more news on this work.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Joey.
Thank you. Now, if you've been inspired by this conversation and you'd like to support the work that AWC is doing, we're really at the forefront of this work, looking into how feral predators use the landscape and how best to control them at a large scale. Please consider making a donation before the end of the financial year. There's a tax benefit as well. You can do that by going to our website, australianwildlife.org, or by getting in touch with one of us at AWC. Next week, we have a special guest. It's AWC's Chief Executive, Tim Allard. I'll be joined by Tim to talk through the big picture of what AWC's mission is, what we're trying to achieve, and some updates from our partnerships. So please tune in at the same time next Thursday, where I'll be talking to Chief Executive Tim Allard. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you next time.